Welcome back, Weirds and Weavers, to the channel Shinobis, where today, oh my god, I need to stop doing these votes. Okay, I'm kind of joking, but also, Jesus Christ. I'm not gonna lie, every single time I put these votes, while I do plan to at some point do all 4 towers I show as an option, there are certain towers that I'm more excited to do than others. And so far, no joke, every single time I put it up to a vote, you guys have somehow voted for my least favorite out of the 4 options every single time. I don't know how, but well, that's how it's worked out. So Total Transformation Alchemist is the tower for this week. Again, I was going to do it at some point anyway, but I must admit I was sort of dreading it. I did want to do it at some point, so I still decided to put it on the list, and I've got no one but myself to blame for that, because I do think it's an interesting enough tower with enough mechanics I need to explain to people who are maybe not super well versed in exactly how you're supposed to use it. I definitely think this is the kind of tower that's so overcomplicated and convoluted to use correctly that your average player probably has no idea how it's even supposed to be used, so a video on it would be very helpful. But I was not looking forward to how stressful a run with Total Transformation would likely be. But first of all, while I don't usually do this, how about I start by even just telling you what Total Transformation does? I mean, most of the time I skip this part because usually, well, people know what the tower does, you know, people generally know what all the towers do in BTD6 unless they're brand new. But in the case of Total Transformation Alchemist, it genuinely might be one of the single least used upgrades in the game, and as a result, I wouldn't be surprised if a decent amount of you actually aren't super well versed in how it works. Total Transformation Alchemist costs 48,600 if I remember correctly in Chimps mode, which transforms himself as well as 5 other nearby monkeys into monsters with laser vision. These monsters attack extremely quickly, and they are also technically considered the same type of tower they already were before they transformed. They just now attack completely differently and look different. I know this sounds like a weird distinction, but essentially, the point I'm trying to get across is, say you transformed a dart monkey into a monster. Now, the alchemist is a magic monkey, and so you might expect that the monster would now be a magic tower. But because the tower is still technically a dart monkey, just one that's had its attack replaced with the laser vision and the cosmetics replaced with the monster cosmetics, that means it's still considered a primary tower. So despite the fact that the transformation is a magic tower, you still have the ability to receive buffs from things like primary mentoring. This is going to be important for later, but either way, yeah, essentially this ability is just essentially a way to transform towers into extremely high DPS, fast-firing monsters, so that you can get enormous amounts of DPS in short bursts for an extremely high price. So, what's the deal with this upgrade? Why is it so bad? Why does no one want to use it? Well, I think it's pretty self-explanatory, honestly. The Alchemist itself is almost useless when it comes to DPS. That is, at least without the ability. And while he does get the ability at tier 4, it just doesn't transform other people. At tier 4, the uptime on the ability is abysmal. I'm not even sure if it's up even a third of the time, let alone half of the time, like most abilities are. And so with such a poor uptime on a tower with practically no DPS that costs a good few thousand to even get to that point, it's a pretty hard pill to swallow. It makes it extremely difficult to actually successfully save up for the Total Transformation Alchemist, because at tier 4, it is just not very impressive and extremely inconsistent in terms of being able to defend, even if, while the ability is active, you do get a lot of damage for cost. So, for one, this ability is just really hard to get to in the first place. 48,600 is a steep price, and while it's not so steep that it knocks it out of being viable, it is just barely within the affordable range. For me, typically, I tend to consider a tower kind of absurdly expensive to the point of not really being super helpful 90% of the time in Chimps, once it manages to cross the 50k threshold. And obviously this tower just barely goes under it at 48,600, which again, does mean that it's affordable, it's doable, but it's just barely doable. And when you combine that with the fact that this is an ability that isn't always active, and when it's inactive, you have nothing, that is really, really tough to deal with. Now, thankfully, it does seem like, and I don't think this used to be the case, so there was probably a buff at some point, but the last time I used this tower seriously was so long ago that I have no idea when it was. But either way, I remembered the uptime on this ability being awful, but it actually seems like now it's not too bad. It seems to be about a 2/3 uptime once you get it to tier 5. Still not great, considering that means a third of the time you're going to have no DPS, but hey, at least 2/3 of the time you have ludicrously high DPS. Because, for all the bad things I'm saying about Total Transformation Alchemist, here's the good part of Total Transformation Alchemist. The damage on this ability is fucking absurd. Genuinely, if you're in a situation where you don't have infinite money, you don't have the ability to just go ultra free play and get like a Vengeful Temple of the True Sun God or something like that, or a level 100 Paragon, if you don't have tons of money, but for whatever reason you need to get some fucking ludicrous DPS for the price you can afford, then Total Transformation Alchemist is often one of your best bets. The only reason why this damage usually isn't helpful is because it's honestly so much damage, you often don't really need the amount that you end up getting with the upgrade. Usually, you have so much damage that it's kind of overkill. Meanwhile, when you don't have the damage, you can barely stay alive. Obviously, this just isn't very stable. It's very hard to have a consistent defense with this, and while you can try and get things to catch leaks, it's kind of hard to get away with that when you're already spending so much of your total money for the entire game on chimps on a single Total Transformation Alchemist. I mean, one Total Transformation Alchemist takes up nearly half of your entire cash fund for like the entirety of a full game of chimps. You earn about 170,000 over the course of the 100 rounds in a game of chimps, and the upgrade may only cost 48.6k, but you got to remember you're paying 5,000 before that for the tier 4, and 3,500 for Unstable Concoction, and a couple thousand for the upgrades before that. And when you add it all together, you're talking more like 60, 70,000. Not to mention, this tower doesn't do anything if you don't give it things to transform, and that itself takes setup. Because, as we're about to get into, if you want to use this upgrade correctly, should not just be dropping 5 towers and pressing the button. There's a little bit more to it. In fact, there's a lot more to it. And this is why this upgrade is so convoluted to use, and so clunky, and yet with such potential to go through the roof if you could set it up correctly on some of the more difficult maps. So that detail I mentioned earlier of how when you transform a tower into a monster, it's still technically considered the same tower, just with its attack replaced and its cosmetics reskinned. Because that is the case, it means if they have some kind of buff they're only able to receive because of the tower type they have, they maintain it even once they're transformed into a monster. This means you can use certain tower-specific buffs and transfer them over to monsters that usually shouldn't be able to get them. And because these monsters already have such ludicrous DPS without any of these buffs, with them, their DPS goes through the roof. So what are these buffs? Well, the easiest one to set up by far would be the primary mentoring one. But unfortunately, primary mentoring isn't super helpful on these things. It does work, and I mean, it's not a bad idea. The main problem is that these things already have a lot of PS. And well, primary mentoring just gives them +1 PS, a bit more range, and faster projectile speed. It's not bad, but it's not exactly what we're looking for. You could up it to primary expertise to get even more PS and even get a damage bonus, and that would be significant, but primary expertise in its own right is quite expensive. So while I think that's a doable strategy, it's not the strategy we're going for here. We can do better than that, and for cheaper. So this brings us to what I think is typically the most popular use for this tower. Again, I rarely see it used, so I'm kind of guessing here. But from what I hear, it sounds like the most common use here is to use it with Shinobi ninjas, because the Shinobi buff does carry over. And so you can obviously just stack a whole bunch of ninjas, get the whole 20 times Shinobi buff, and then activate that total transformation. And 5 of those ninjas will transform into monsters which now have a massive boost to their attack speed and PS. And thankfully, though most PS boosts in this game are numbers-based rather than percentage-based, Shinobi ninjas are one of the few upgrades in the game which provide a percentage-based PS boost, which means the PS boost is more significant on the monsters than it is the ninjas, because of the fact that the monsters have more PS to start with, so a percentage increase leads to even more PS than you would have gotten if you were just doing it on a normal ninja. However, I decided I wouldn't go with Shinobi ninjas. I decided instead to go with Poplusts druids. You see, Poplusts druids can also do the same thing. Obviously, similar to Shinobi ninjas, they can buff other druids in their range, giving them a percentage-based PS and attack speed boost, just like Shinobi ninjas. Only theirs is a larger boost that stacks less but costs more to get in the first place. Now don't get me wrong, there are downsides to the Poplust strategy. For one, earlier in the game's life, the Poplusts strategy used to be easier because the Total Transformation Alchemist used to be able to transform the Poplusts directly. However, later, at some point in the game's life, they made a change where Total Transformation was no longer allowed to transform Poplusts druids, which now means you can't transform the Poplusts druids directly. You have to transform other druids that get the buff from the Poplusts druid by being in their range without being a Poplusts druid themselves, which adds even more towers onto the screen that you need to micromanage. These druids are typically upgraded to Druid of Wrath because the gradual attack speed boost you get for continuously attacking as a Druid of Wrath also transfers over to the Total Transformation Alchemist monsters. And that is a very powerful boost if you can set it up. It's not as consistent because you will lose the boost if you press the button too early on the monsters before the druid's been able to attack long enough, or if they spend too long not getting any pops and lose the buff. But if you make sure to wait long enough for the druids to get a 100% attack speed boost from the Druid of Wrath effect and then hit the button, you'll have double damage Total Transformation monsters with Poplusts buff on top of that. So let's talk about the pros and cons of the Ninja or the Druid strategy, since those are the big ones. I really wasn't sure which of these would be better out of the Ninja or the Druid strategy, but I ended up settling on the Druid one eventually. You see, my main problem with the Ninja strategy is twofold. For one, I think the Shinobi Ninja buff just isn't significant enough unless I'm going to go for the full-on 20 Shinobi Ninjas. And quite frankly, no. Ninjas might have a smaller footprint, but they still, when you have to get 20 of them instead of just 5 druids, take up more space in total. And as you can see, we are desperate for space. Even on a map with a decent amount of space to be given, we're still running out stupidly quick. So we can't really afford to run the Ninja strategy here, I don't think. The other issue is, I didn't run the numbers, but I think the Ninja one is actually more expensive. The price adds up more gradually, which makes it more manageable sometimes, but the total amount you'll have to spend on getting all those Shinobis, I think would exceed the amount that you would need to spend on getting all the Poplusts. Not to mention, I think the Druids are more self-sufficient and will be able to defend themselves without outside help while you're waiting to save up for the Total Transformation. Whereas in the case of the Shinobi Ninjas, I probably would have to pair them with a Sticky Bomb or a Bloom Jitsu while I'm trying to save up for the Total Transformation, which is yet more money I'm chucking down the hole when I need as much of it as I can get. Now, the only problem with this is, even if the Druids end up taking up less space despite their larger footprint just because we don't need as many as them, we still need 10 Druids to do the strategy correctly. We need 5 Poplust Druids and 5 Druids of Wrath. And as well as that, we need to ideally get all 5 Druids of Wrath inside the range of all 5 Poplusts Druids, while also having all 10 of those Druids inside the range of Oban to get Oban's buffs to Druids and Magic Monkeys. But then we also need to get all 11 of these towers, which all need to be in the range of each other, under the range of an MIB village so that they're able to pop all Bloom types. But also, we want that MIB village to give discounts because, well, we're buying a whole bunch of tier 3 druids. We would be losing a lot of money if we didn't get a discount village. But then also, we're missing out on a lot of damage if we don't get jungle drums, which now means we need a second village. And that way we can get double discounts, but that means we need to find a way to get 2 villages next to each other, which then contain 11 towers within their ranges, and all 11 towers need to have each other inside their own ranges. And all of these towers do not have particularly small footprints. I'm sure you see the problem. I genuinely don't even know if this is logistically possible, even on easier maps with more wide open space. At least not the optimal setup. Thankfully though, jump back to what I said earlier, you might remember that I said the main problem with Total Transformation is while its damage is stupidly impressive, the one problem with it is it's often kinda too much damage. You don't really need the amount of damage that it provides when you use it correctly a lot of the time. It's kind of overkill. And while more damage doesn't hurt, it certainly would be more helpful if you had it more often rather than having it less often but having this damage be so stupidly high to the point where you never need that much. What I'm getting at is, who said we need 5 Poplusts? All we need is 1 or 2 Poplusts here. So we don't go for an optimal strategy here. I fully accept that right here, I'm going to be stuck with only 2 Poplust buffs rather than the 5 that would be optimal. However, I can live with that. You're going to see throughout this run, the damage of the Total Transformation is so through the roof that we don't need 5 Poplust buffs. This thing melts everything in the game. And by not getting those last 3 Poplusts, not only do we not waste as much space, but we also have more money left over to help deal with those moments when we do have to deal with the downtime of the tower, and we do have to use things like Absolute Zero to stall for our cooldowns to come back. With all that said, as you can see, this is another strategy where we don't have a whole bunch of other towers, but we do have some. For one, I had to start with a triple dart start, and I transferred that into 2 sharpshooters. This might look a little bit strange, and I will say I didn't plan for 2 sharpshooters. I only meant to get 1, but then I realized I needed a second one to beat the first Moab. You're going to be seeing I reset that round a lot, trying to figure out how to get past it. The early game of any run that is going to be trying to run Total Transformation in the mid game is always going to be a nightmare. Until you get Total Transformation, it is ludicrously difficult just holding things together. So while I did realize it was a little bit wasteful to get this second sharpshooter, I also realized it was probably fair considering this is likely going to be the single most difficult part of the run, and it sure was. So I don't really regret getting this second sharpshooter. As for why it's a sharpshooter specifically, it's mostly just because I may as well use these dart monkeys that are already here that I needed to place anyway. But also, you might notice in general, I used crossbow monkeys a lot. And while I'll keep some of my commentary on that until we finally get around to the Ultra Boost plus Crossbow Master video I've been waiting to put out for ages, I may as well take a moment here to say that, yeah, I think the crossbow path for the Dart Monkey is severely underrated. Well, I don't know about severely, but I never see anyone using it or singing its praises. And in my experience, it's just extremely reliable, well-rounded, cheap early game defense that also helps you not having to buy camo detection until the 40s, which means that you can often save more money for better defense for rounds like 39 and 40. Quite simply, it's just a very well-rounded tower, which for a cheap price can carry you through the early mid-game really, really effectively. And I mean, that's my concern right here, getting through the early and the mid-game without Total Transformation yet, so it seemed completely fine to get some sharpshooters. As well as that, you might see me using the Beast Handler, which you might be surprised to see after I said how much I hated it in the last video. Still stand by that. However, I was thinking that it might be more useful to use it while using much lower tier upgrades, so that's what I did here. I got the Bird Path Beast Handler so that I could swap the lanes the balloons are on to store them extremely effectively for a nice and cheap price. And this ended up being more than worth the money. I remember I was really worried that I might be throwing away too much money when I bit the bullet and got it up to a Golden Eagle later down the line. But no, that Golden Eagle was well worth the money. The amount of times that it saved my life in this run was a lot. I genuinely kind of think that this might be the single most useful thing the Beast Handler has for Chimps mode, just getting tier 2 or tier 3 birds just to store balloons. And not actually using for its intended purpose of merging together a huge beast. I will admit, I was a little bit disappointed because I really wanted to use Energiser with Total Transformation, since the only problem with it is its downtime, and obviously Energiser helps reduce that downtime. The only problem is the same thing I said in that video. Energiser is just too expensive. Even if you use Energiser to severely reduce the downtime of the Total Transformation Alchemist, it still has downtime, just less of it. And you're still going to die in that downtime if you don't have a powerful stall option like an Icicle Impale, a Super Glue, or an Absolute Zero like we get here. And an Absolute Zero and all those other options in general are cheaper than an Energiser while being more effective at keeping you alive while the ability is down. Not to mention, how could you even survive to buy an Energiser? I was fully prepared to bite the bullet and still get an Energiser this run, even knowing it was going to be suboptimal, just for the pure fun factor and being able to combine 2 super niche and, usually never used towers and chimps together. Again, Energiser plus Total Transformation sounds really fun, but I'm not gonna lie, I did a bunch of attempts of this run on different maps that I didn't record in preparation for this video. And I'm actually quite thankful to say for once that might have paid off, because the very first attempt I recorded was the winning attempt, where I was honestly kind of expecting this would be a lot harder and I would fail a lot more before I got a winning attempt. But that being said, I did have a lot of failed attempts before I started recording, again on different maps, just getting my footing for how I'd even set up a Total Transformation Alchemist in a game of chimps. And I quite simply could not survive to get both an Energiser and a Total Transformation Alchemist. I tried, I constantly min-maxed and optimized on all these different maps, and in my experience, unless you were playing a beginner map on chimps, you simply couldn't survive to get both an Energiser and a Total Transformation. They're simply both 2 5th tiers that make you extremely vulnerable to leaks after dumping tons of your money away. And when you have to get 2 upgrades like that in a row that are both overpriced, it just leaves you way too wide open. I think the only way it would be possible, funnily enough, would be if you could get a Crossbow Master early on, and then use the Crossbow Master as a powerful mid-game carry so that you don't have to spend like any money in the mid-game, and then from that go to an Energiser, to a Total Transformation, and hopefully that's all you need. But even that, I've given it a couple goes, and so far it hasn't gone so well. Although in fairness, that strategy in particular, I only ended up trying on Cargo, which is an advanced map in fairness. Oh, this is also why I cranked down the difficulty a little bit on this Unpopular Chimps and picked an intermediate map. It may be Bazaar, which is an intermediate map I consider to be on the harder end of intermediate, but it's still an intermediate map. Again, we usually like to do easy expert maps or harder advanced maps for these kind of things whenever I can, because then I feel like I'm doing a better job of showing you how the tower is actually better than you think. I'm not just using it to beat a fucking beginner map on Chimps, which, by the way, it's a little bit hard adjusting to know how to play Chimps, so don't feel bad if you are struggling to beat Chimps even on beginner maps. But trust me, like, once you know, like, the score, once you know the checklist of things you need to do to beat a map on Chimps, you can really beat any single beginner map on Chimps with just about any fucking tower in the game, no matter how bad it is. So I feel like, you know, it wouldn't really be fair of me to go pick a super easy map, show an upgrade destroying it that's actually awful, and be like, look guys, it's so good actually. Glavelord is actually the best 5th tier in the game. You just have to pick Monkey Meadows. I'm not gonna lie, for once there was very little reason why I specifically picked Bazaar as the map for this challenge. It was mostly just because I initially wanted to do it on Cargo, but I found that it was too hard to get through the mid-game on Cargo. It was probably doable if I, you know, did more resets and just kept going at it, but it was getting extremely tedious and I just didn't want to deal with the hassle. I was planning to cram a lot of my defense on the top right side of the map, just to the right of the Moab lane, and I thought that would work quite well for this strategy, but in reality it's actually quite bad, because that means you only catch the Moabs at the entrance and they start moving away from you as they go towards the exit, which often meant that the Total Transformation Alchemist would crack open the Moabs but then not be able to shoot the ceramics because more Moabs would move into the way and block the lasers, meaning the ceramics would just run right for the exit and kill me. And while I could try and place something at the exit to clean up leaks, it wouldn't be ideal because all my villagers to give cost discounts and buffs would be at the bottom right of the screen, not the top left. Now there's probably some other maps out there that I could have tried, but well, I'm starting to run out of maps, so I might break this rule soon, but so far I've only been doing maps on Chimps that I haven't beaten on Chimps before. I feel like it just spices things up a bit, rather than rehashing maps I've already done. I am starting to run out of advanced maps that I consider to be playable. In other words, not Pat's Pond, that I haven't beaten on Chimps mode yet, so maybe that will change in future when I start running out of options. Honestly, the main reason I picked this map was mostly just to get it out of the way. I'm really not a big fan of this map. I think visually it's very pleasing, but actually playing it is kind of miserable. And this felt like one of the few strategies I could try on this map that actually would be okay and wouldn't be really obstructed by the annoying layout of the map. I did consider doing Cornfield because I do like that map a lot more, and I haven't done an Unpopular Chimps on it because it was the very first advanced map I beat on Chimps, so obviously I technically haven't played Chimps on that map in ages. However, I did want to play a map with water just in case I did find a way to make the Energizer strategy work. I didn't in the end, but I didn't know that was going to be the case, and I wanted to leave the door open. And of course, there's no water on Cornfield. And in fairness, that might have been a good call, because while if you go all in with the Total Transformation damage strat, you probably can deal with a bad. In this case, because I didn't go all in, I just barely didn't have enough damage to deal with the bad without a first strike. So if I didn't have water, I might have been in trouble. Lastly, let's talk about the hero I picked, Obin. I'm not gonna lie, I actually did put a decent amount of thought into this, even though it might not look like it, because it seems like Obin's the obvious choice. I mean, his whole gimmick is buffing magic monkeys, and well, druids, alchemists, magic monkeys, you see the connection. It seems at first like this is the obvious pick, but there is actually another pick that, well, I really considered using instead. And that would be, of course, Geraldo. But this time, it wasn't just because he's simply one of the most powerful heroes in the game with the most utility. It was because I thought that his rejuve potions would be critical to being able to use Total Transformation Alchemist effectively, considering the fact that, well, the main problem is the downtime. And so having the ability to at any moment just pay 2,000 and get the ability back instantly seemed like it would be a lifesaver. And don't get me wrong, it would be. However, I slowly moved over from Geraldo to Obin, because while at first I thought that Obin was the obvious pick but probably not optimal, I forgot about the fact, and in fairness, it's absolutely tiny so I don't blame myself, but Obin does give a 5% reduction to the cooldown times of all magic monkeys in his range, which does affect Total Transformation Alchemist. And while 5% isn't much, every little bit really counts now with this ability, so I'm actually really happy to have that 5% boost. But in fairness, that's not the only reason, it's just one of the reasons. Probably the more important reason is that Obin is more consistent in the early game, and also the buffs he provides to the druids is really significant and allows them to hold their own way more effectively while I'm saving up for the Total Transformation Alchemy. When I was using Geraldo earlier with my older strategies, it did feel nice to have the Rejuve potion, but it also felt like every round I needed to be dropping glues, Jerry Fires, Genie Bottles, Rejuve potions. I never got to save up any money because Geraldo on his own, with just the Druids and the Total Transformation Alchemist hardly ever having its ability up and not even necessarily being a Total Transformation yet, just being a tier 4. All those things combined just led to me constantly having to pour all my money into Geraldo items in the mid game. And while I could have always just gotten more towers to help hold down the fort while I was saving up, I honestly probably would have needed to spend around 30k on extra defense if I wanted to get consistent defense without spamming shop items. And yeah, that really would have left me tight and out of pocket for things like Total Transformation later down the line, as well as any support I would need to give it. So I genuinely found that I think that Oben is better, especially because his abilities are really, really good at catching leaks. I mean, that's the one thing they're really good for. They're not very good in terms of pure DPS, but they're very good at being consistent. I mean, balloons can't go through a wall of trees if it's still got more capacity in it, so it's the most consistent way to just put a wall up and say stop. And again, the problem here isn't damage numbers, the problem here is having consistent defense and ways to catch leaks. So, Wall of Trees and Brambles is doing exactly what we need it to. Not to mention DDTs are a concern as well, and at higher levels, Oben can use Wall of Trees to eat up DDTs, absolutely saving our lives. Especially because we can't really kill the DDTs otherwise without the ability being up of Total Transformation, and that obviously would lead to it needing to be up for way too long for it to even be possible to deal with rounds like 95 if it weren't for the help of things like Absolute Zero and the Wall of Trees. With all that said, what's my verdict on Total Transformation Alchemist? Well, I gotta say, I wasn't expecting to be saying this, but I think it's more positive than it was for the Sentry Champion and the Polkai, believe it or not, which I didn't even expect that was going to be the case going in. I expected I would have a middling opinion of the Sentry Champion and a similar opinion of the Polkai. However, I ended up coming out with a very negative opinion of the Sentry Champion and a very negative opinion of the Polkai, even though with the Polkai I could see the potential. Meanwhile, with Total Transformation, I won't say it's good. I do think it's very justified that it's, I guess, slept on technically. Because, similar to Super Monkey Fan Club, the setup for this ability is absurd, and the amount of space you need to get all the setup you want is unattainable. Not to mention, even if you have the space, you then need the money, which is also really hard, and the tower itself is awful at holding its own without outside support, which then means you're losing even more money. It has a lot of severe downsides, and the effort involved in setting this up correctly and using it to its fullest ability is absurdly over the top. That being said, I can't lie. I think my opinion has improved somewhat on this ability. I still think it is not necessarily very practical in chimps, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a couple maps, maybe even 1 or 2 expert maps, where it's just doable enough it's not a bad option. The main obstacle I see is just surviving the mid game, but it doesn't seem like Total Transformation is a bad option for maps like Workshop, let's say, where the main issue is just how short it is and how fast balloons reach the exit, in which case the ludicrous over-the-top DPS might not be over the top anymore. You might have so little space to work with that you actually need that much damage in that short amount of time. I don't mind having to deal with the downtime to get that damage. Again, the only reason I haven't tried that on an expert map is just because it sounds like it would be absolute hell trying to survive to even, place that in the first place. But if you could get there, then I feel like it could definitely make it to the finish line. Whether this tower is usable on any of the more difficult maps in the game, either way, it's certainly fun, I can't lie. And it's certainly a useful utility to have, because even if you aren't going to use it in chimps mode, if you're going to take on something like a boss fight, I imagine this is actually one of the better DPS options. It's just that most people probably don't use it because it's a nightmare to set up in the first place. But if you have the funds and the know-how, then I imagine there's a decent amount of boss fights where using something like Total Transformation Alchemist is one of the best ways to get a good time. With all that said, thank you for watching. I think for my next Unpopular Chimps, I might forgo the voting. I will go back to the voting soon, but the Ultra Boost plus Crossbow Master video has been sitting in my videos folder for a while now, and I really want to get it out. And the same goes also for the ISAB Monkey video. I really want to show you the ISAB monkey run, but it hasn't been voted for yet. So I think at this point, I don't want to have it sit there too long and another update passes by and I still haven't, you know, put out this video that I recorded 2 updates ago. So I think I need to get that going. With all that said, once I got those videos out, I'll go right back to setting up votes for these things, and I'll try and come up with some more ideas for what I might do for Unpopular Chimps. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.